Welcome to Dangerous Policy. This is Crispin. I wanted to send you a special recording given some of the developments that are happening presently in relation to the border struggle between China and India. We have some really great content coming up in the podcast with a friend Tanvi on India, and though we will be focusing very much on other issues, mostly cultural issues, things to do with expat community, how India is coming out on the world, changing the societies both within India and within the West, is having a significant positive influence. Nevertheless, I do want to take time out from that to have a quick discussion about what is happening between China and India in a more geopolitical, historical kind of context. And for those that don't know, India and China struggling across the line of control. They have had their first fatal exchange of fire in over 45 years. News is kind of coming out as we speak. However, it seems like at least 3 Indian soldiers have been killed and probably 5 Chinese soldiers have been killed. So it does seem to be quite a significant incident. And this does have some historical context. So I do want to kind of paint a picture for all the listeners out there as to what the relationship between China and India is like, what the current conflict is in that context, and what are some of the risks and opportunities that we can expect as a consequence of this very, very serious border clash. So, as most of you would certainly be aware, both China and India are massively large countries in terms of population. Together they make up, almost half the world's population just between them. And they have had a long history of intercourse between the two across the very significant and, at least as powerful as any ocean, the Himalayas as a barrier between the two countries. So certainly this is not the first time that they have clashed along the border. Most famously, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that incredible 13 days in October of 1962, when the US and the Soviet Union almost had a nuclear exchange over nuclear weapons being found in Cuba. Right in the middle of those 13 days, there was a major border conflict between China and the Indians, and this resulted in, almost half the world's population being in a state of potential war. So, it's no secret to say that India is increasingly hostile towards China. Their relationship has significantly deteriorated, not that it has been overly positive and warm for many decades. However, there are 3 main issues, in my view, that make the relationship between India and China particularly toxic. The first is what is represented in this clash, the border dispute. Now, it's quite interesting because China, while it has very significant border disputes in the maritime sphere, so significant water boundaries, they have that infamous and quite ridiculous 9-dash line that has put them at odds with every single country in the South China Sea region. They have nevertheless managed to secure their borders through final settlements with most of their land. So I think, something like of the 14 countries or so that border China, almost all of them have settled land borders with the Chinese government. And India is one of the final countries that are outstanding in that regard. So there is this sort of border dispute. And now, neither country has any interest really in escalating too much over just the border. We are talking about a very remote part of the world, and the most significant thing that is at stake here, and it shouldn't be underestimated, of course, is the prestige of these great and powerful emerging nations. Because, if they settle the border on their own terms, then that kind of sets the norm for potentially the region. And the fact that they have been unable to settle that border is an indication of ongoing instability and tension. Yet there are two other areas that are also quite important. The first is the historical and ongoing relationship that China has with India's enemy Pakistan. In particular, China's material contribution to Pakistan's nuclear program. China ensured that under no circumstances would Pakistan's nuclear program fall significantly behind that of India, which is why that within weeks of one another, both India and Pakistan in 1998 were able to test, nuclear devices at the same time. Now, the Indians, I don't think, will ever fully forgive China for that, because it means that there is a highly unstable, potentially Islamist nation on its border that has sponsored terrorism within Indian borders, and Mumbai attacks most famously, which has limited India's ability to respond, because if India escalates too much, punishes Pakistan for these cross-border attacks, then Pakistan has the ability to launch a nuclear strike either on its own territory against advancing Indian forces, or indeed at a strategic level at Indian population centers. And that is something that that threat is something that India has China to thank for. So that is a serious, I think, enduring fixture that is a barrier between those two countries repairing their relationship. And the third is because of China's increasing maritime presence in the Indian Ocean, which India sees as its backyard, typified indeed by China's long-term lease that it has secured from Sri Lanka, where it is stationing military naval assets, including submarines. That leasing is effectively compensation for a debt trap that China put Sri Lanka into. So when Sri Lanka was unable to pay these absurd debts, China demanded access to a port for its military purposes. So this sort of mercantilist trade practice where China is expanding its military presence in India's backyard is something that is very unwelcome in India. And then, of course, now we've returned to this border dispute. So it's in that context that I think India really cannot afford to back down. I think that the Indian population is considerably outraged by China's increasing pressure on India. And for India to kind of just back down at this point would be a serious blow to, I think, the prestige of the current Indian government, which is, unlike China, fully answerable to its people in the form of a democracy. So this puts a significant pressure on India. So what does this mean for some of the other players? Well, first and foremost, of course, is the United States, which will be doing its utmost to conceal its otherwise abject glee that China and India are at each other's throats. I'm sure that it has been quietly communicated to Washington from New Delhi that the United States should try and remain observably neutral, because India will not want to be perceived as being in any way a proxy of the United States in its own dispute with China, and it would not also want to be seen as escalating or putting China in a position where it has no option other than to basically dig in, certainly if it was to multilateralize what is a very remote border dispute, in drawing in other major powers, then that would make de-escalation of this crisis considerably harder. So absent a significant escalation of the conflict, which may indeed occur, I think we'll find very muted responses from the United States government, something probably a little bit anti-China, but not anything like, they're going to intervene on India's behalf. There is the Russian Federation, and I think they do have a significant role to play. In fact, they'll probably have a much bigger role to play than the United States, not because they are in any way comparable in power or have interests on that remote border, but because uniquely almost in the world, they have excellent relationships with both countries. So, of course, the Russian-China kind of axis is basically a full-blown alliance in an orbit name at this point, while Russia has had a long-standing, many decades-long connection with India ever since basically India's founding, and Russia was the Soviet Union. So India buys significant amounts of military equipment. Much of its nuclear program comes from Russian sources, and the people-to-people exchange is still quite significant. So Russia will probably play a mediating role, definitely not wanting to see it escalate. And if I was to guess, I don't think the Chinese really want to escalate this either, particularly as they now have another outbreak of coronavirus in Beijing. They are having increasing trouble getting contracts for Huawei with significant pushback from Western countries. So the last thing they really need right now is a major flare-up with a country that they have cohabited with for 2,000 years. So they definitely will want to de-escalate, but they'll probably want to de-escalate in a way that saves face. India is likely to gain something over this crisis, despite China blaming India quite vociferously. I think that ultimately China will see it in their best interest to gracefully back down, and if China is intelligent, they should find a way to permanently negotiate a final border with India. That will mean giving something up, and I would recommend India press its claim, because now is a very good opportunity to pursue its probably legitimate claims to the areas in the line of control. Yet, are there risks? There are major, significant risks. Certainly, Pakistan could act as a spoiler. Unlike Russia, Pakistan actually has an interest in seeing the conflict between China and India escalate, because the gap between India and itself, Pakistan, in terms of power, is now astronomical. Pakistan is no longer a serious competitor of India and sees India as a perennial threat. So if India was divided in its attentions between itself and China, then that can only be good for Pakistan. The nuclear relationship is very complex between these powers. I mean, if we look at this interlocking series of nuclear relationships, Pakistan has the fastest growing nuclear arsenal probably in the world. That obviously has an impact on India's threat perceptions, which in turn makes China feel like its nuclear arsenal is inadequate. And then that, of course, has implications for the United States. The United States is also diversifying its nuclear arsenal towards lower yield options in the Western Pacific, which flows back the relationship the other way. So the potential for a major nuclear arms race flaring out of what is an otherwise backwater kind of border dispute is not insignificant. The actual direct conflict escalation could well happen. One side or the other could overestimate its leverage, push to the point where the other must forcibly respond, and that could easily escalate into a major conflict. One would hope that at that stage cooler heads would prevail, because you do have to be mindful over the potential risks to both sides. Nevertheless, if I was in New Delhi's shoes, I would feel at this particular moment that I had probably the best bargaining position to terminate hostilities with a favourable peace.